Well, thank you, Maya, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to you. I'm very pleased to be able to be here today. I've been asked to speak about the history of the American dream, and I'm going to start that history in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries in England. I think that's where the foundation for the American dream can be found. And since that time, essentially, the foundation has simply been built upon, expanded, expressed in different ways. So we want to start with the history of feudalism. And the likelihood is that many of you do know something about feudalism. And for the purposes of 1 hour, we don't need to know a great deal. Essentially, feudalism is a land-based form of human organization. In England during that time, during the Middle Ages, the king allotted plots of land to nobles. The nobles in turn handed on smaller plots of land to the ordinary people. In both respects, both the nobles and the ordinary peasants owed something in return. With respect to the king, the noble owed loyalty and typically men and materials to support an army. With respect to the peasants owed to the nobles some degree of the economic abundance that they were able to acquire from the land. So this was an agrarian land system. And it's important to place ourselves in the context of this time period. Everybody who was not a noble was in one way or another a peasant. There were many, many poor people, very few people with any wealth or power. This is quite a different world than we're familiar with. We're used to speaking about equality and increments and small margins between people. This was not the circumstance. The circumstance then was there were very few people who were quite powerful and very many people who had very little economic power or other types of power or influence. So these were folks who were struggling. They were given land to work, but they had to work it themselves. Virtually everybody was engaged in an agrarian lifestyle. So people were raising crops, and that meant everything that had to do with farms and harvesting and so forth. And they were domesticated animals, of course. And so they were milking cows and sheep and so forth, and also slaughtering animals for meat. But it was a very impoverished lifestyle generally. No one had surplus. No one was storing up surplus. There was not a way to store, for example, money and call upon that money or other resources later. Foodstuffs are perishable. There are ways that they can be preserved, they can be canned. Of course, there was nothing like freezing. You could not freeze food, you could not store food in a freezer. These are obvious observations, but they're important to recall because many of the conditions that existed at that time were not particularly favorable to human beneficence, to human sustainability. There was a high degree of mortality. Infant mortality was very high. People were dying young. It's not possible to catalog all of the ills that humans experienced during the Middle Ages without going on at great length. But the important thing for us to recognize is that conditions were harsh for most people. It was a constant battle against disease. It was a constant battle against heat. It was a constant battle against cold. Perhaps our current circumstances, just having come out of, at least partially come out of a pandemic, with heat waves in the west and torrential rains in the east, is a little bit more reminiscent of what the Middle Ages in England might have been like. So this is the starting point. There is one other factor, and I just referenced it, but now I'm going to specifically talk about it in the Middle Ages, and that is the Black Plague. So like our pandemic, there was a plague starting in the 14th century. And estimates are that the Black Plague, which started in Messina, Sicily, at least in terms of Europe, it was brought to Europe on a series of ships that docked in Messina in the middle of the 14th century. That estimate is that the Black Plague killed about 20 million people, which at that time would have been about a third of Europe. Now, we are rightfully appalled. We are rightfully appalled that the pandemic we're currently experiencing, the COVID-19 pandemic, has killed 4 million people worldwide. A third of the world's population is a death rate of a much greater magnitude. This had considerably disruptive effects, quite obviously. When you have a third of your population dying, there's going to be fear, there's going to be chaos, there's going to be disorientation, there's going to be grief on a major scale. It was a terrible time. Now, the Black Plague subsided, but over succeeding generations, over the next several hundred years, the Black Plague teemed again briefly. It was not as serious, and the death toll was not as high the next successive times, and there were several. But it was a constant reminder of the fragility of life, and it made an actual impact. And the impact was this: it decimated the rural population in the 14th century, and that meant there were not enough workers. There were not enough people to bring in the crops. There were not enough people to milk the animals. There were not enough people to slaughter the animals. There were not enough people to do all the things that needed to be done. With respect to the animals, by the way, mammals were also subject to the Black Plague. And so not only did people die, but, approximately a third of, the animals that were domesticated died as well. And it presented, of course, a terrible problem, disposing of bodies, so forth and so on. The thing about a plague, in a certain respect, or any calamity, is that human life has a resiliency. Human life has a tendency to reassert itself. And that also caused tremendous disruption. So in the 15th century, after 60, 70, 80 years of recovery, all of a sudden times got just a little bit better. And because they became just a little bit better, life reasserted itself. There was a dramatic increase in population. Now, it was not a replacement for the 20 million instantaneously, but rising population can cause as much chaos as substantially declining population. Generally, human beings do well with stability. And anything that causes dramatic instability, whether in prices, population, just relations between human beings, that causes problems for society. And so that's what happened starting in the 15th century. There were too many people. There were too many people for an agrarian society to support. There was not enough land. Families would have sons and daughters. There was not enough land for those sons and daughters. The whole edifice of feudalism was starting to collapse. Now, this collapse was not instantaneous. It's very much like the collapse one can think about in the United States more recently, in small towns and rural areas. It no longer takes as many people to run a farm as it did 50 years ago, 100 years ago in the United States. There aren't too many people on the farm in a certain sense, and yet there are not enough people in rural areas. It does not thrive anymore. And so if you travel through the United States, you will find, that there are these many struggling small towns, and they have boarded up storefronts, and they have storefronts for rent. And so once again, changes in migration, changes in population make a dramatic impact on our society. So returning back to the Middle Ages, here are these extra people. Where are they going to go? Is there anywhere to go? Well, there really was nowhere to go under feudalism. And the king, over time, made a determination that some of the feudal lands, which again were never owned by the peasants and really never owned by the nobles, these were royal lands that were given in stewardship to the nobles, and the nobles gave them in stewardship to the ordinary people. Well, the king decided that there should be a limited number of leaseholds available from the royal lands. The idea was that, in fact, it was not possible to sustain everyone by giving them land, but there would be leaseholds where one could rent land. In the past, the rent was a form of tithing in a certain sense. It was a barter system. That is, if you grew food and you grew animals, you would give some portion of the food and animals, again, to the noble, who would distribute them to support armed forces and so forth, so on. Now it's a question of a cash economy. This was a brand new thing. Yes, money had been invented a few thousand years before, but money was in short supply. Money was not common in many respects. And so people did not rent. In fact, they received, their allotment in return for. Now, some of the royal lands were going to be leased through the nobles. The nobles would be able to lease them. At the same time, the peasants were released. They became free wage workers. That is, there was no place for them in the feudal system anymore. They had to go out, and jobs as such, were not really identified in precisely the same way they are today. So you have many, many workers who really were underemployed, unemployed, had no job. They also had no land, and they had to make their way. This presented an untenable situation for decades, quite frankly. To recap, England was rural. England was agrarian. There were very few small market towns. London had only about 40,000 people and was far greater than any other city. Perhaps there were not any appreciable cities other than London. They were towns up until that point. Where were people going to go? What were they going to do? These young men, principally, became sort of a roving band of unemployed. They tramped, to use a British word, across England. And they eventually did make their way to the cities because the rural area was so hospitable. They had been shown the door. They had been told effectively to go away. Now, as all this was going on, other things were going on. And the major thing that was going on was that in the reign of Henry VIII, which was from 91, excuse me, to 1547, King Henry, as you may recall, became engaged in a dispute with the Catholic Church, with the Pope. King Henry wanted a dispensation so he could divorce his existing wife, who would not bear him a son, and marry his subsequent wife. But divorce was not permitted in the Catholic Church. And so he sought an annulment, special dispensation from the Pope. The Pope refused it. And he refused it repeatedly, and he refused it over years. And King Henry, as you may recall, said, I really don't need your church. I'm going to convert all of my citizens to Anglicanism. They are no longer going to be Catholic. I am going to be the head of the English church. And by the way, I'm granting myself a dispensation, and I am getting divorced, and I'm also divorcing the Catholic Church. Well, once again, you can imagine this was very disruptive. People benefit from stability. Here you have a remarkable destruction of a way of life just overnight by royal decree. And it created divisions. There were many who did not want to leave the Catholic Church. There were dissenters. We know of a number of groups prominent in American history because they were some of the most vocal dissenters. I will only limit myself to comments about two groups. There were many. One group was the Separatists. The Separatists believed that they needed to separate from the new Anglican Church because the Anglican Church under Henry and subsequent kings had left the fold. The Separatists believed, that the changes that had come about could not be rectified. They stood in stark contrast to the Puritans. The Puritans simply wanted to purify the Anglican Church, and they did not want to leave. They simply believed that reforms were necessary. What had happened after Catholicism was that the Anglican Church retained many of what are called high church practices. These are highly formalized, highly ritualized practices. If you think about even the current Mass, it has a structure, a form. It is always the same. It is unchanging. There is an agenda for it 52 weeks a year. And the Anglican Church maintained many of these similar practices. And the Puritans believed that was a mistake. They wanted to reform the church, but not leave it. So you have these two groups. And so while the economic conditions are going on, there is substantial religious oppression. The archbishops who were under the thumb of the king, more so during some periods than others, wanted to demand obedience from the Separatists and the Puritans both, and many other groups. It was about hierarchy. It was about power, and it was exercised. And this meant that the Separatists and the Puritans were constantly being chafed by the church elders, by the church leaders. The Separatists were the first to try and make a break because, in fact, they were ready to leave. They wanted to leave. They went to the Netherlands. They lived for a couple of years as a group. It was a small group. Not all of the Separatists were ready to move at that time. They were very unhappy with the Dutch. They thought the Dutch did not practice their religious observance in the proper way. They also had a very difficult time as outsiders in Dutch society, just making a living. Their neighbors were not friendly. They were not wanted. The Puritans, meanwhile, are just experiencing the same sort of oppression that the Separatists had. They were constantly besieged by representatives of the king and the archbishop to change their practices, given decrees, and so forth. Eventually, the Separatists decided to separate even further. There had been this new effort to open up the New World, that is, North America, which of course becomes our country. And in 1620, the Separatists sailed for Plymouth, Massachusetts. Henceforth, they came to be known as Pilgrims. All right, so the Separatists and the Pilgrims are essentially the same thing once they come to the United States. Why Pilgrims? Because that word connotes someone who travels a long distance to venerate a particular form of religious expression or their God. And that's what the Separatists did. They traveled a long way across the Atlantic in those days. We will have to place ourselves back in that era. It took months in a leaky ship. It was too small. They typically did not have enough stores other than to barely make it across. I mean, it was a difficult passage, and it always was for, the next several decades. The Pilgrims were doing this for religious expression. So one of the things we see is the twin themes that, for dozens of years, 100 years now, and that is, one of the principal motivations was to make life better materially, so economics, but a second purpose was to make life better spiritually through religious practice. Now, one of the things that historians, I think, have tried to correct is this. There is a tendency to say, for example, that the Jamestown colony, which was founded by the London Company, which was incorporated for the purpose of investors making a profit, merely addressed the economic motivation, the desire to make a more profitable living. And the Plymouth Bay Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony arguably both addressed only this religious purpose. And that really is reductionist. What do we mean by reductionist? What we mean by reductionist is taking a principle or statement or proposition that tells us something true and make it explain everything. That is an improper approach to historical explanation. The fact of the matter is that the Puritans themselves were suffering economically. The Separatists, as I described, were suffering economically in the Netherlands. They were not wealthy people by and large. They were church people. And so the fact is that in most instances, there was some overlap, some crossover between different goals. John Winthrop himself, for example, who led the Puritans on the Arbella in 1630, his biographers describe many financial claims on Winthrop that they conclude contributed to his decision to leave England, that it had become financially difficult for him. And by leaving some of his debts behind and by leaving his adult children behind, who actually were the source of a number of his debts, His circumstances personally, would coincide with his religious motivation. And no one really suggests that he did not have a sincere religious motivation. But in fact, if you have a sincere religious motivation and you have other reasons, perhaps to move, maybe that tilts the balance. With respect to the Separatists and the Puritans, it's important to realize many did not leave. Many stuck it out in England, regardless of the circumstances. And, this is always the way with migration. Starting in about 2015, tremendous migration from Northern Africa to Europe. So 2015, 16, 17, a little bit less since then. But did everyone leave? Did everyone leave Libya? Did everyone leave other countries across the the southern rim of the Mediterranean? No. There's always some selectivity. And so that was the case here. It was really relatively small numbers from Plymouth, the Plymouth Bay Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And over time, right, there was an increase, but it was very limited. And so, we look for the foundation of the American dream in these journeys. The American dream is sometimes said to be a journey. Here you have it. You can see what it's motivated by. And in both instances, it is really desperate conditions that motivate it. And one of the things that's happened as well in terms of revisionist history is to change those desperate circumstances into the lure of opportunity. This is kind of a semantic trick in a certain regard. Nobody really knew whether it was much of an opportunity to go to the east coast of North America, where there were no settlements. There was forest. And inside those forests, there were indigenous American settlements. No one had invited, the settlers to come join the indigenous American settlements. There was nothing awaiting the Puritans, the Separatists, Jamestown, except more pestilence, more disease, more hard work, more privation. So the idea that there's this opportunity is a very modern idea. There may be opportunity to come to the contemporary United States, where many things are in place. There's an infrastructure. Perhaps you can access it. But in 1620 or 1630, it was the desperate circumstances at home that created the yearning to go elsewhere, even if elsewhere really did not offer very much. And that was the circumstance. And so one of the things we need to appreciate is that the original meaning of the American dream might be considerably different than meanings that we put on the American dream today. It probably means a substantially different thing, and we need to appreciate that. Jumping forward, the first known instance of using the phrase "the American dream" in print seems to be 1931 in a book called "The Epic of America" by a fellow named James Trussell Adams. He was a popular historian. So he was not affiliated with the university. He was not doing university research. He was doing secondary writing based on other people's research. And he was a good writer. He told good stories. He told them in an effective way. And at the end of his book, he spent 9 pages in his epilogue talking about the American dream. And he said, if the United States was only known for upbuilding itself from essentially an empty, barren land, although admittedly with indigenous Americans surviving in it. But if the only thing the United States could be known for was building cities, building motor cars, building a better material way of life, would that be enough? And Adams' answer was no, that would not be enough. What the American dream is about, arguably, from his point of view, he defined it as giving everyone an essentially equal opportunity to benefit from the American experience, to live a better life, whatever that might entail. And he did not define it only in material terms, although that's very, very common for people to assume without examining it, that it only means a better living, more money, more things. He was quite clear that it had to include the freedom for anyone to become what it is they envision as a man or a woman, that the spirit, was an important factor if a person said it was. If a person said, I need, to pursue my life in this way, that was the key for Adams. And to a certain degree, that definition sometimes gets swept under the rug. It's very famous, but it's not always pursued. I'm going to check my time. It looks like I've still got about half an hour. So I can speak further about the American dream today a little bit. I think those are the historical observations that I would like to make. I'm happy to take questions about that portion at any time, but I would like to talk about the last several decades of United States history. So jumping forward from the Middle Ages, jumping forward from England to essentially the 20th century. I think perhaps it's something that you haven't had from other speakers, and that would give me an opportunity to briefly introduce that as well. If you think about the 20th century, it effectively begins, the long 20th century effectively begins in 1890 with the Gilded Age. Why was it called the Gilded Age? It was called the Gilded Age because the wealthy had become wealthier, and it was conspicuous wealth. For perhaps the first time, there was a national wealthy class, and that wealthy class was building mansions left and right and dominating and creating industries. Here you have the great railroad barons. You have Rockefeller with oil interests. You have the Vanderbilts, you have the Morgans. You have these nationally famous families who are wealthy, and they're not afraid to spend that wealth, and they're not afraid to spend that wealth on themselves. And so it's a period, in a sense, not unlike ours. We too have that wealthy class. We too have those mansions. We too have the golden chariots, sometimes called the Lexus now, and so forth, so on. And, that brought many concerns to the fore. Within 20 years, there would be antitrust legislation to break up the monopolies. So Standard Oil, which was Rockefeller's concern, was broken up through the Sherman Antitrust Act. There is now talk of antitrust acts being resurrected. They've been sort of dormant and dead for quite a while now. People were talking about applying them to Google and Facebook and other large entities based on monopolization. So all of these things are going on. At the same time, there are many recessions. Uh, Capitalism has often been characterized as boom and bust. And there are cycles. Right now, we're awaiting earnings reports tomorrow from Chase Bank and others. And many people are prophesying that there are going to be some very healthy profits again. So even though we are in the tail end, we hope, of a pandemic, a time when economics has been very difficult for many, we're on the verge of record profits, perhaps. This is, part of the fascinating history of the United States. How does the American dream persist in a climate like this? Because in a certain sense, it's always a climate like this. There are booms and busts. If we go through the first few decades of the early 20th century, what we see is every decade or so, there is going to be some sort of repression. And so you have the start of World War II. Things are moving along. World War I, my apologies. World War I comes along. That presents economic difficulties, even though the United States is isolationist until 1918. But as soon as the war ends, what do we have? We have the Jazz Age. We have opulence. We have people spending money. We have people drinking gin and speakeasies because of Prohibition. The 20s were a wild time. What are they followed by? World Depression. World Depression starting in September 1929. How long does that depression go on? It goes on for a decade. And what ends it? World War II. So here you have, these continual cycles where James Tressel Adams in 1931, 2 years into the Depression, is talking about the American dream. And he was rather optimistic. He thought that in a year or two, he actually says a year or two from 1931, I think this is all going to end. I think we're going to go back, to the yellow brick road. We're going to resume our ascendancy. But we need to be careful about it. He was very cautious because, again, materialism was not everything, but he thought it was important enough that it did need to end. Well, he was wrong. All right, he was wrong about that. What was the Depression like for ordinary Americans? Well, on the one hand, Ford Motor Company in 1930-31, which was a major concern at that time, was laying off tens of thousands of people. There were tens of thousands of laborers who were not going to have jobs. There was no market for motor cars. You couldn't support it. It had collapsed. Just like the stock market had collapsed, the market for motor cars had collapsed. Now, did that mean no one had motor cars? No, of course not. In a country with terrific inequality, there are always some people doing well. And so if you study the Depression, you find the stories of anecdotes and facts, statistics, of some people doing quite well. There was a man who had lost his job. He says, the best thing that ever happened to me. He said, I had some good friends. They were in the music or lyric writing business. And they gave me a pencil and sat me down and told me to write songs. I started writing songs. I got pretty good at writing songs. I made a wonderful living writing songs for the rest of my life. Best thing that ever happened to me. That's not everyone's story. The thing about a country where, again, opportunity is uneven is some people are going to benefit. There are opportunities hidden in niches in the economy all the time. Are you fortunate enough to be at the start of Facebook? Are you fortunate enough to be at the start of Microsoft? Are you fortunate enough to be at the start of Google? If so, you're probably wealthy now. If you're not fortunate enough to be in on the start, it's a different landscape. And everyone understands, that there are places in the United States that offer more opportunities than others. And so this is the continuing story of the American dream now. Do we mean the same thing that we did as we did in England, for example? There was no phrase, the American dream, but, must we wait for desperate conditions, to drive people to seek something better, even if they have to leave the United States? Presently, it hasn't come to that, but that's the way the American experience started. And of course, for some, and it's important to remember this, I made modest reference to Indigenous Americans. It's even more important to speak about those people who definitely did not come to the United States to seek opportunity. And they are the ancestors of slaves themselves. There's nothing about opportunity there. It was coercion. It was force. It was theft of people's lives. And the United States lives with that legacy. There's, not much positive to say about that. It's delayed reparations in every regard. So how can the American dream, this positive, optimistic idea, be retrofitted, reconstituted to fit the slave narrative? It can't. All right, that would be revisionist history of the worst sort. And again, it's one of the things that continues to contribute, to the uneven playing field in this country, which is very apparent. As you work through the succeeding decades of the 20th century, you encounter, many of the same factors that we've already addressed. You encounter Jim Crow in the South. Jim Crow, of course, are the series of laws that were unlawfully imposed on African Americans, so that there was, as the Supreme Court said in 1896, in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Of course, it was separate, but it was not equal. Continually shabby conditions, poor circumstances were what described schools for Black Americans, any facilities for Black Americans, housing for Black Americans, and rules that only applied to Black Americans. One had to sit in the balcony of the theater. One could not sit on the lobby floor, and many other instances prevailed. And so, the 20th century is, in certain respects, this continuing battle, a civil rights battle, which you can see it, in old tape, and truly was a battle. Whites were pitted against Blacks in the South. White mobs would attack Black school children. All of that is there. And how does the American dream fit in? Well, once again, it's an idealized statement that focuses on certain features that are rather exaggerated and ignores other features. And so the original impetus, once again, was terrible conditions, terrible oppression. The question becomes whether the American dream can be realized a little bit more accurately through dispersal of resources, reparations, various things, opportunity going forward. But the origin of the American dream, again, was quite a different narrative, and so considerably different than where we are now. Let me tell you one more story, and since I started a few minutes early, I can take questions then. One of the questions about the American dream is typically whether or not it is resources alone that make the foundation for a better life. And there's a book out, not by me this time, called Chasing the American Dream. It's by a sociologist named Mark Rank. He's at Washington University in St. Louis, a colleague of mine. And he tells the story of Robert Greenfield. Well, who's Robert Greenfield? Robert Greenfield is a financial advisor in the greater St. Louis area. And all of his clients have between 300 million and several $billion. So they're not quite Bill Gates or Melinda Gates, but they're wealthy. And he's been doing this his entire career. And Rank interviews him for his book. And he says, well, tell me about, your clients. And he said, by and large, they're some of the most unhappy people I've ever met. And Rank, of course, is a little bit startled. So he wants to hear more about why they're so unhappy. He said, well, these are generally the follow-up generation. They are not the source of the wealth. They typically have received the wealth as a legacy. And therefore, their role is stewardship. And most of them feel that burden. He said they are burdened by the money. They think about the money all the time. They wonder if they're doing the right thing. They wonder if they're doing the right thing by giving it to their children, not giving it to their children, spending it, not spending it. How are they investing it? He said for most of them, it's a terrible burden. He said they're not very happy. And so one of the places that American Dream Studies has gone in recent years is more or less what's called well-being studies, where it minimizes the importance of economics, because in fact, studies of human beings suggest that economics only have a certain limited appeal. You can only have so much money, it seems. You can only do so much with money. It just cannot buy you certain things. And having too much of it is about as bad in certain ways for most people than having too little. And so American Dream Studies focus on physical well-being, spiritual well-being, all these different forms of being healthy, being well, that in and of themselves don't always cost a lot of money. But economists and others generally agree that in the United States today, family of four, starts to feel comfortable, healthy, well, with $75,000 annual income a year. Is that enough to afford everything? No, it is not. But, seeking more than that seems counterproductive in certain ways. It doesn't make people happy, by and large. And again, these are probability estimates, based over large populations, doesn't relate to anyone. Does it, a particular person? In other words, is there someone with billions of dollars who's very happy? Perhaps it's Richard Branson. perhaps as Jeff Bezos. But again, it doesn't seem appreciably to help many people's mental health, way of life, satisfaction, happiness, terms that they themselves have to define. So that takes me back to about 55 minutes, and happy to entertain questions. I realized that, there's a tremendous span of history to cover. I knew that an hour was not going to do justice to the transitions during feudalism to the age of settlement. And of course, I skipped several centuries there. But I hope that it was helpful to you.
Thank you so much,
Maya,
Professor Hauhart. I was gonna say that there's a couple people with their hands raised. If you wouldn't mind answering some questions, I think we'll go to around 12:55.
I'd be happy.
Hopefully that's okay. Okay, great. Mohammed,
Sure,
I
yes,
think
it
you
is.
raised your hand first, so you are welcome to unmute and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I have a kind of a general question about the idea of religious reformation as it happened in early times in Britain. So how would you suggest that religious reformation would take place in countries or states? Where is the beginning point for such thing to happen?
Well, without knowing which religion or which country we're talking about, which probably makes a great difference. I think the first thing is the level of perceived oppressiveness, because the Puritans and the Separatists were aggrieved. They were extremely unhappy, and they were in conflict with the church hierarchy. It was rather open conflict. On occasion, the archbishop would close their churches. I mean, they were being forced out. And when it becomes that oppressive, people are going to rebel, revolt in some way. And of course, that may include just leaving, which the Separatists had always intended. They were always ready to leave. They did not believe the Anglican Church could be reformed, so there was no point in it. They were just planning on leaving. They had left spiritually, and they had left physically to the Netherlands, and then, they eventually left to Plymouth Bay Colony. So I think it has to get to a level of oppressiveness.
Yeah, thank you.
Sandhya, I see your hand is up. You are welcome to unmute.
Do you think that the American dream now in 2021 is more focused on moving to opportunity or moving from desperation? Or is it a mix of the two?
Well, it depends where your starting point is. I have a paper coming out in the Rutledge Handbook on the American Dream, Volume 1, which I'm editing, which talks about Mexican, Guatemalan, and other Central American migrants. And of course, the economy in Guatemala, as one example, has been decimated by decades of civil war. So conditions are not very good there. For them, it is focused in the immediate present on their current circumstances, which are not good for many peasants. And it's easy to speak of peasants in a country like Guatemala, because again, it's very agrarian. The technologies that they're living with and the bad conditions for agrarian growth, might as well be centuries ago in some other place. And so they're driven by desperate circumstances. And then on the other hand, the United States is a big fat target. It's a lure. Conditions are better here. there's not a civil war going on right at the moment, even though there's a political war or a culture war almost continually. But it's not truly a civil war. It's much safer in the United States than it has been in Guatemala in recent decades. And so, yeah, it's a mix. Now, if you are an upper middle class undergraduate at an elite Eastern institution, the likelihood is a person like that can, focus exclusively on opportunity. Why? Well, in many cases, there's not a desperate condition driving the person. If they're driven, they'll be driven both internally and socially by peers and parents and so forth, to achieve. And there's a lot to achieve. So yes, you can achieve in the United States still today. Many of your professors, they've achieved. So have I, so have many others, my colleagues. So it's a mix. It depends on your starting point.
Thank you.
And I think we'll take one more question before we end off. So Alyssa, I see your hand is up. You're welcome to ask your question.
Towards the end of the lecture, you were talking about happiness and how people with more wealth and more money are statistically less happy because they're always thinking about money, about if they're giving their kids enough, if they're giving it too much, if they're investing it right. How is this happiness measured?
Well, it's typically measured through survey data. There's something called the General Social Survey, and it's routinely and continuingly sent out, to random samples. It's been done in different ways over the decades. At one time, it was phone interviews, but of course, people don't have landline phones anymore, which makes it more difficult. And numbers for cell phones are not as readily available. There used to be public directories published all the time and so forth. So it's changed in format, but essentially it's a series of questions. And you get these questions along what's called a Gutman scale. And now you've all seen Gutman scales, but no one calls them Gutman scales anymore. And that's where they originate from. Essentially, it's a 5-point scale. In most instances, you can make it a 7-point scale. So it starts at the top with an assessment like wonderful, and number 2 is very good, and number 3 is neutral, and number 4 is not so good, and number 5 is terrible. You've seen these kind of scales that scale anything. And you create the questions, a series of questions, which permit you to hone in on people's expressions of satisfaction or well-being or happiness. And you get to control the words. So over many years, there have been, many different ways of asking the question. So you can ask someone, if you and your family were to make another $100,000 a year, would that solve all your problems? And, if people are honest, of course, they can think of the many problems it would solve, but they can also think of problems that it might solve, not solve as readily. Money is not a solution for everything, although no one turns it down or suggests that it can't be used for, good purposes. Clearly, if you have mental health problems and you need mental health care and you want the best, it's nice to have money. But in fact, the money itself won't solve the mental health problem. It might get you access to someone who contribute, but there are things that can't be solved. And you've all recognized that. There are diseases for which there's no medical solution right at the moment. And, so money won't solve all the problems. And so you go about it that way. It's a series of questions. and repeated over time as well, which helps.